right, I want to begin by setting, in a way, the context for why I want to talk about what I think of as the American ethic of success. And it actually begins, in a way, with kind of a depressing mode. So we'll begin with some optimism, a little depression, look at our culture. This talk is one in a long series that David Kelly began called The State of the Culture. As objectivists, we're very interested in the culture itself, not merely politics, but the underlying ideas. And we try in these talks to check in every once in a while and try and get a glimpse of what's going on in the culture, get a little bit of the pulse of it. And that's what I'm trying to do today. And I want to begin by talking about Ayn Rand's American ideal, because I think when we think about America as objectivists, we're thinking about that ideal that she described so beautifully in so many essays, that she underlined in The Fountainhead and in Atlas Shrugged particularly, where she's reflecting on American culture and what makes it special and important to her. Now, Ayn Rand idealized America. You know, she grew up a marginalized person in a Russia that went from being nasty and authoritarian to being nastier and more authoritarian under communism. And she saw America in the movies, and she thought of it, you know, beyond being a city on the hill. She invested it with every dream, really, that she had, with every vision of what Russia was not, what things ought to be in her conception. And that idealized America was an America that was building skyscrapers. It had a statue to liberty in its main port. It was a place where people were free to be whoever they wanted to be. It was a place where people were empowered to do whatever they needed to do, where each person stood on their own, where liberty was the religion, where rational effort was the leitmotif, was the dominant culture. That was the idealized America of Ayn Rand. And we see this in her encomia to 19th century capitalism, like in What is Capitalism, for instance, or America's Persecuted Minority, Big Business. I mean, two of her essays that show this, where she reflects, or in Atlas Shrugged, where in a collapsing 20th century America, the idea that America was once a really free country is embodied. And, you know, when she's thinking about 19th century capitalism, she's thinking about figures like the kind of builder of the Great Northern Railroad, James J. Hill, who did it all with private money. Is that Nathaniel Taggart? Or someone like the banker J.P. Morgan, who dominated the American capitalist scene, funded and created so many companies. It really built late 19th century industrial capitalism. Is, you know, he Midas Mulligan? Maybe. But so that's Rand's vision of this wonderful America of the 19th century, where people's individual freedoms were respected, where a commitment to reason and rational values was important. On that end, I should mention about J.P. Morgan that when he was a boy in the middle of the 19th century, his banker father wrote to him. J.P. was in a boarding school. His father wrote to him about the ethics of being a banker. And what is that ethic? That ethic is work, be honest, have integrity. So this vision of a morally founded, free society, wasn't an empty idea of Rand's, there was a truth to it. And yet, there was a lot more going on in the 19th century than just that. And, in the real America that Rand lived in, Rand came to America in the middle 1920s, and she lived in America that wasn't that 19th century America. It was America very quickly evolving in its ideas into something quite different. And she spent the rest of her career appalled at that and panicked about it. And that's what Atlas Shrugged is, in a way, is an expression of how bad she thinks it was going to be betrayed. But the real America that Rand lived in was one of continual and ongoing, up and down, but generally ongoing technological progress, which we can see in the growth of real GDP per capita, real productivity per capita, not inflation. There's no monetary inflation represented in this growth curve. This is the real productivity, the real wealth that has been created and created and created. But in any case, Rand lived in an era of real technological progress. But she also lived in a period of philosophical regress, where she was hard-pressed to find major intellectual defenders of freedom and rationality, where the really dominant views in the intellectual life of the country were egalitarianism, feminism, environmentalism, hedonism, the hedonism of the hippies, that's what I mean, the beatniks. And then a conservative reaction that just emphasized traditionalism and service and duty. Buckley's, in 1950s era, God and Man at Yale, where the problem in culture, according to Buckley, William F. Buckley, is just that people weren't praying enough. It wasn't, in reaction to the enormities of the left, the answer was more prayer. That was the situation that philosophically that America was falling into. And this had effects that Rand saw in her lifetime. When she arrived in America, it was already committed to antitrust law and trust busting because of ideas that attacked the wealthy and attacked productive creators. And in her first decade of time in America, the New Deal came in. The administrative state has metastasized in America with all the different administrative agencies that exert plenipotentiary powers over our activities, and these get created more and more. The recent Dodd-Frank law, created a banking adjudication board with essentially, if you read the law, the powers are, if they want to shut down the whole darn economy and take over any bank they want, anytime they want, they can just do it. That's the kind of power that's been invested in the government. We've gone, coming out of World War II, into sort of an endless cycle of a war or two every 10 years, enforcing a Pax Americana internationally. I think there's a lot that can be said for that project, but there's also a lot that can be said against it. But that's, again, an example of the investment of the state in the expansion of power. A political effect that came out of the egalitarianism and the feminism were civil rights laws and laws promoting equality of treatment in society, and these have had some positive effects. Culturally, there are things that we'd really like to see, but the legal context hasn't always been the best because of the degree to which it intrudes the government into private decisions. And of course, the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson came at the sort of end of Rand's career, with the government creating a huge a set of entitlement programs. So this is the depressing part. By the 1970s, at the very tail end of Rand's career, Rand had felt like these philosophical chickens had come home to roost, that they were cashing out more and more in the culture. And certainly in the 1970s it looked that way, we got into a cultural mode that we still now have, where really, for serious intellectuals, the fundamental lenses that they use to look at society are race and class and gender. You can't hardly study in a university and do any kind of social studies or humanities study and not have to genuflect to these categories of analysis. And of course, the regulatory state keeps growing. There are continual attacks on logic and reason from the left and right. And even defenders of science are often happy to say that logic and reason aren't right. But the 1970s sees the publication of like the Dancing Wu Li Masters, where science is taken to a proven Taoism. And it, of course, was a period of stagnation and inflation, or stagflation, in the economy. So you can't blame Rand for feeling depressed about America at that time. And she pleaded with Americans to she said, don't let go of the American sense of life. Don't let go of what's great in American culture. The sense of and she thought that even in, say, the 1970s, and I think we're still in this condition today, there's an American sense of life, perhaps not always well articulated, but present in the culture. And if you travel internationally and go from one culture to another, something you'll notice in America: the independence of the people, the basic reality orientation of the culture. Still, it's a happiness and enjoyment-oriented culture, and it's a culture that values achievement. People that comment on the business environment in America compared to other places will say, culturally, there's practically no other place in the world where business achievement is respected as much as it is in America. So these things are real, and they're part of the American sense of life. But in Rand's view, a sense of life is an emotional and not well expressed set of subconscious values. But it's shaped by the actual way in which a person lives, and shaped by the ideas that the person holds that they use to guide how they live. And a culture is just an agglomeration of people, and the American, so in that sense, the American sense of life, I think, has been in peril in my lifetime, certainly, just because of the ongoing situation of having an intellectual life in the country that is certainly dominated by ideals and forces that are deeply inimical to it. So it's in that context that I spend time, and I think many of us do perhaps, looking at what's going on in the culture, the discussion of ideas, looking for traces of the kind of expression of ideals that we might sympathize with, and looking to see where that happens. But, say I read the New York Times a lot and look for these things, and what I find out, say, reading the New York Times, is that not only are Ayn Rand's ideas not breaking through, that among the literati of New York, reading Ayn Rand is considered as bad as reading Mein Kampf. I mean, there's a significant cultural group in America that thinks that simply thinking about Ayn Rand makes you uncultured and, not even worthy of talking to. That's scary. That's very scary. So in this context, in looking out at the society, I got interested in where do we find discussions of ethics? And I got interested also in something that has seemed more and more true to me as I've thought about how people live, that there's often a distinction in people between the values they profess and the way they actually live. I find personally, when I try to assess people, I try to think what kind of character they have, I try to pay a lot of attention to how they actually live rather than what they say their ideals are. And I think in our culture in America, we've got a similar kind of divide on ethics. We've got a division between ethical talk and real, meaningful, practical ethical counsel. So when we think about ethical discussion, there are a variety of venues in which that takes place, and I just want to go over a few of them to talk about the lay of the land. So, of course, there's ethical discussion in the academy, in the universities, lots and lots of writing and discussion about ethics and what it means and how they think, what it implies about how to live. But mostly they mean, just sacrifice yourself. That's what they mean. And of course, there's the religions, the churches, they talk about ethical and moral behavior all the time and counsel people on what to do. And politics, there's a lot of moral exhortation that goes on in politics, of course, and the political discussions are a big arena of ethical discourse. You think of Barack Obama's, speeches saying, you didn't build that. You didn't build that. That's an ethical statement about responsibility. It's not a political statement about policies. And another important area where there's ethical counsel is in psychological counsel and in the self-help industry. I mean, in a way, this is really a very important area where people spend a lot of time trying to give each other very practical advice about how to get along in life and do better, achieve happiness. Another place you can find a lot of ethical counsel is in memoirs, where people reflect on their own lives and they reflect on important moments in their lives, and they then usually have in there some lessons about the right choices to make, how you ought to conduct yourself. And we get ethical discourse in charity fundraising, where ethical ideals are appealed to. Here's give your neighbor a helping hand. And of course, there's the topic I want to talk about today, which is graduation ceremonies. Very much at graduation ceremonies, university commencements, but also high school graduation ceremonies, and then these have been proliferating, so they have them in middle schools, they have them, they're taking the opportunity to have these all over the place. But the mode of these discussions is for people to come and try and speak to the young people that are there and talk about life lessons or give them some takeaway message of wisdom that they're supposed to carry away with them. That's the mode of it. Now, I think there are, in a way, before I come back to talk some more about graduation ceremonies, I think there are sort of two Americas, or two ethical Americas, and I don't really mean the left and the right, or the religious and the secular. I really mean the difference between the people that are engaged in what I call the ethical pose, or engaging in ethical talk, and the people that are engaged in ethical counsel. I mean, I have in mind here the difference between, say, imagine an academic who's writing a paper in ethics, contrasted with someone who's giving a speech to a group of young people about the lessons the speaker has learned in life. And the academic operates in a culture where one is supposed to reply to the questions raised in academic debate. I mean, that's the point. And a certain radical pose, striking your Marxist colors, showing that you can state something outrageous, is supposed to be, really can be a part of that academic culture. But in any case, in that culture, it's much more important to be interesting than it is to be right. Far more important to be interesting than to be right. Some of the most respected philosophers have written interesting books in one period of their career and written other books that contradict those books in other parts of their career, both lauded because the books are interesting. They can't both be right, but they're interesting. And the other thing is that academic ethics is mostly divorced from practical questions. That is, ethicists in the academy who insist on a unity of theory and practice are very few, and those who actually put their theories into practice are fewer. So the academic that I have in mind is striking an ethical pose. The academic talks about morals and good and evil, but the whole point of the exercise is to make noises of which the culture will approve. The culture in the university, and the intellectual culture in general. It's not surprising then that, say, in academic discussions of ethics, because self-sacrifice is in a lot of the public discourse about ethics is considered sort of the stopping point, the one thing of which you may not speak ill, then that's the thing to which they genuflect continually. Regardless of then how they go about putting together their dinner, what choices they make buying cars, how they negotiated for their last salary, and how they really want to raise their kids. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But some of the graduation speakers I've seen have had a really very different purpose in mind than this academic I was talking about. But at least it seems that way to me. They were reflecting on their choices, and they were trying to speak in terms of practical principles. They were giving lessons for living life well. And this practical counsel is really interesting to me as an objectivist. This is where people talk to each other about how they actually live. And so it doesn't just reveal their sense of life, but it reveals their conscious understanding of it. And so in this sense, I'm bringing back what seemed to me to be very good news, good news from the world of graduation rhetoric, and that's that the American sense of life is very much alive, and that when they think about it, lots of Americans know how to express it. And again, if you read the New York Times a lot, getting any news like that would be very encouraging. Be very encouraging. But in the graduation rhetoric that we see today, we see both elements of pose and of practice. We see both practical counsel and ethical pose. And I think we can see this if I talk briefly about two different speeches that the First Lady, Michelle Obama, gave this past spring. Michelle Obama came to my alma mater, Oberlin. Actually, the mayor of Baltimore, who's an Oberlin graduate, was scheduled to speak, but then they had those riots where they burned down all the buildings, and the police turned out to be corrupt and incompetent, and she didn't. So funny, she didn't show up then for the graduation speech. But Michelle Obama came in to fill in. And now Oberlin College, where I went to college, is notable for a couple of reasons. One is the first racially and sexually integrated college in America, the first. And it then has a sense of itself as being a morally important place, and that's translated in the last couple generations to a strong identification with the left in the culture of the country. Stronger than most universities. In the life of the university, in the life of the college, it's very strong. I went there, I know. Political correctness wasn't this odd thing that you heard about. It was the warp and woof of the whole way we understood ourselves. Now, of course, Oberlin is also a respected liberal arts college. Now, at Oberlin, so the First Lady was there, and the first thing you would notice about her speech is that she was speaking to privilege. She thought she was speaking to privileged people. So she wanted to talk to them about their responsibilities. And so she skipped as quickly as possible, and in half a sentence, over the students' accomplishments and their prospects. And she moved on to say, sort of assuming that everyone at the college embraced the politically correct ideals of the college, was saying, "I'm proud and inspired by your commitment to service and social justice." So that's why she was glad to be there, because the students, were presumed to be committed to social justice. And then the rest of the talk calls on them to be committed to involvement in practical politics to promote the leftist agenda. That's what it does. Now, being involved in politics is a virtue if you're on good premises. So it's not like this is a useless thing for someone to say, that being involved in politics might be useful for promoting your ideals. But this isn't life counsel for the average Oberlin student. the average Oberlin student is actually not a warrior in the leftist causes and actually has a whole life before them that's going to involve, even if they are strongly leftist, is going to involve a lot more than agitating for self-sacrifice and leftist politics. So that's why it seems to me that at Oberlin, Michelle Obama wanted to strike a pose and not share life lessons. She imagined that Oberlin students would be soldiers in her crusade. And she just didn't want to engage with their practical problems. But now, around the same time, she went and spoke at the graduation ceremony of the mostly black Tuskegee University. And there she identified with the students. And she spent a fair bit of time lauding their hard work and their accomplishments. And she commiserated with them then also on the experience of being on the receiving end of irrational prejudice as black people. And it seems to me, this was more practice than pose. It seemed to me that here she was thinking about them as living whole lives and what the experience and shaping forces in their lives would be. She had her take on what they would be, but she wanted to talk to them about how they ought to conduct themselves and deal with the broad sweep of issues they might encounter. And that seemed to me to be more practice in its content than pose. So I think even though we see both kinds of discourse, both practice and pose, in graduation rhetoric, in the balance, I think we see a great deal of talk focused on practice there, and we see relatively little pose, as compared with, say, academic ethics, where you see almost no practice and almost entirely pose. I think then when we hear this discussion of ethical practice in graduation rhetoric, we hear the American ethic of success. And here what I'm about to summarize is what I've taken away listening to a bunch of graduation speeches and hearing them. It's what motivated me to give this talk when I started hearing it over and over in different speeches I attended. So it has these elements that I've noticed. It begins with a clarion call of eudaimonism. Take charge of your destiny and live to be happy. Take charge and live to be happy. And then it cashes this out in a full-on advocacy of productiveness. It says work, and persevere. You're not just going to have to work, you're going to have to fight through. You're going to have to persevere and succeed. And I heard this recently, for instance, when the mayor of my city spoke at my son's high school to the National Honor Society induction ceremony. Now, the National Honor Society honors scholastic achievement, but it's a product of the mixed premises America of the 1920s. And its stated purpose is to honor those students who've demonstrated excellence in the areas of scholarship, leadership, service, and character. But the mayor of Albany didn't dilate on that theme. Instead, she dilated on the importance of following one's dreams and making the most of life. When she came to service, she touched on each of these points, the scholarship, leadership, service, and character. She touched on each of them. But say when she came to service, she cast volunteering as a way to step outside one's comfort zone and experience the richness of life. And the main thing was what she called finding your why. So she said to each student that you should work to achieve. You should be believing in yourself. And you should be trying to be the person that you want to become. So wow. I think that's the American ethic of success. And it's notable that the mayor is a self-identified progressive. Okay? So this is not just news from one wing of the American culture. We're not talking about a pro-business Republican here. But she was definitely giving voice to the ethic of achievement. And I've heard this ethic of success repeated over and over in different graduation ceremonies. Another example was that the local police chief spoke at an inner city middle school near me, and there he compared life to the labor of Tantalus. pushing a boulder up a hill. But he rejected the fatalism of the myth. He rejected it, very explicitly, and he urged the students to struggle through, to keep pushing and keep pushing to get to the peak, to push it all the way up. And so he was promoting the pursuit of a dream and hard work and perseverance, with an emphasis here not on the eudaimonistic aspects that the mayor dilated on so much, but on the work and persevere aspect. He was preaching it for the goal of personal success for the individual students, not to carry their society on their shoulders, but to be the best they could be. And often it's people in business who sound the ethic of success. And I think this is really a hugely positive sign, because it means that they see themselves as self-authored entrepreneurs and creators on a noble quest. And, that's awesome. They're not apologizing for it. So for another example of this was that Ed Catmull, who's one of the co-founders of the Pixar animation studios, spoke at Johns Hopkins University. It was just this year. And his main theme there was how to unleash creativity in an organization. And actually, his speech is worth watching just for that, because he gets into what did they do at Pixar to keep being creative year after year after year, and that's why they were able to produce this, really golden age of success in animation, stretching from Toy Story through Up, The Incredibles, to Frozen. Just a real chain of success. But I mention this because towards the end of the talk, Catmull shifts gears to reflect on Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple, and who had been the bankroller and CEO of Pixar. And Jobs was famous for having what was called a reality distortion field, snarkily. He had a reality distortion field because he would insist time after time on getting the impossible from his engineers. And he would push his companies to achieve it. Just one example is a couple of years ago, it came out in the New York Times Magazine, the account of an engineer who had worked closely on the creation of the iPhone. And it was sort of like a play-by-play summary of the whole experience of creating the iPhone. And Jobs had insisted that the iPhone had to not have a visible antenna. It had to not have a visible antenna, but it had to work great. It had to be a radio, but not have any visible antenna. They put it in the rim. And the engineers all said, that's never going to work. You don't have enough metal. It's not extended the right way. It's interfered with in the wrong way. It's never going to work. And sure enough, by the time Jobs was going to demo the iPhone, it still didn't work that morning. That's how bad the situation was. So this was the reality distortion field to the max. He was asking them to do something that they were damn sure was impossible, and he was about to show it to the public, and it still didn't work, right? But the thing is, now every phone has no visible antenna. Every one, even I have a totally cheap-ass phone here, no antenna, right? Every phone, every smartphone looks like an iPhone. Right? So that's the reality distortion field at work and getting people to do the impossible. And so here's the thing that Catmull wanted to say. He wanted to say that the lesson of the reality distortion field is that you control your own destiny, and you can achieve wonderful success through hard, creative work. He said, if you believe, as I do, that your actions make a difference, then this means that you do modify reality. You do create the future. And these kind of statements are just immensely encouraging to me. And they mean that the American sense of life is alive and well. And, in the time of the post-financial crisis, the Dodd-Frank, the ascendancy of a strong anti-individualist ideology in our politics and in the life of a lot of places. And certainly I live in New York State, where this is worse than in a lot of places in the U.S. This is encouraging news for me. And so I think these reports from the world of practical ethical counsel imply that the America that Ayn Rand imagined, the America that Horatio Alger extolled, one of individual achievement and reality orientation, is still with us, and it still can be real. And I think the way in which we can still have an America that can flourish in this way would be the more we can encourage people to own the ethic of success, to deepen and strengthen that sense of life, to defend it intellectually and morally against its enemies, and of course to put it on a firm foundation with a rational philosophy, one that sees creative work and trade with others as the means to achievement and that respects reason as the only absolute constraint on what is possible. So that's my report from the battlefields of the culture and the cheery news that there is an American ethic of success. Lots of Americans know what it means and still think it's what people really need to know to live in life and be happy, and that succeeding in life and being happy is what it's all about. Thank you.
One, I've been to Oberlin College, living in Ohio for 30 some odd years, and I swear they designed everything one way to eliminate the right side of the road. With respect to Ayn Rand.
Oh, you mean like political rightism?
Political rightness.
Yes.
With respect to Ayn Rand, and you mentioned business and her support of it, I agree with that up to a point. I think she always said, now when business starts to get involved with government, now there's another issue there. You have the monopolies and the collusion and so forth. Any comments about the line she drew on something like that?
So I had called out James J. Hill and J.P. Morgan. Rand identifies Hill as one of her models of a good 19th century businessman. And in talking about the history of the American railroads, she decries the railroads that depended heavily on government favors and extols Hill, who mostly raised his money on his own and had relatively few government benefits and built his railroad based on the business prospects. I don't recall her writing about J.P. Morgan. I imagine she must have somewhere. I just don't recall where she did. And Morgan is more of a mixed character because Morgan was involved in currying some government favors. But I'd have to say that if we assess objectively his career, the whole balance of what he did was I compare him to Midas Mulligan because I was just thinking, who was there in American history who had the moral authority and the sway that Morgan did. And Morgan was kind of like the captain of the private American economy for about 20 years and was the source of the capital that organized practically every industry you want to think of. And so it's, his hands are in the creation of late 19th century American industry, everywhere. And he wasn't a replaceable person in that respect. So that's what I think. But certainly Rand thought that she wasn't in favor of business as such, without regard for how it functioned. She decried crony capitalists, or what we now call crony capitalists, decried businesses whose purpose was to simply curry government favors. And of course, in Atlas Shrugged, although the enemies of Ayn Rand and her ideas paint Atlas Shrugged as being about the wealthy, or favoring the wealthy and big business, actually most of the major villains in Atlas Shrugged are big CEOs, like Orrin Boyle and James Taggart. So that's definitely true that Rand drew a distinction there, and she was for people that lived by trade and earned their wealth through achievement. Yep. Ralph.
I'm wondering what graduate speeches are like in Europe or other parts of the world. And one cynical thought I had listening to you talk was, graduation speeches I've heard often are, yes, about how to achieve success for the purpose of improving society, for the purpose of social goals. So I'm wondering to what extent even the positive side might be somewhat of a pose. But in particular, how is it in places other than America?
Well, I actually think that I've noted so about America, certainly there are a lot of graduation speeches where, say, they take, when people speak at elite colleges, they often take the American ethic of success for granted. They assume you're going to work hard and try to succeed, and then they want to tell you how to be moral in other ways. That happens a lot, and sometimes service for society. But the reason I was moved to talk about this was that I was starting to hear, and I mentioned some of the examples that I encountered, regularly encounter graduation speeches where it was not about service to society. You know, when the mayor of Albany's talking to the National Merit Society, National Honor Society, she's not saying, you know, go serve society. She's saying, flourish. You flourish on your own terms. And maybe a little service wouldn't be bad in that circumstance. Stretch yourself, whatever. But yeah, I'm just sort of summarizing, but certainly the gist of the talk was that's not what it's all about. No, that's definitely not what it's all about. What it's about is the ethic of success. Oh, and Europe. Oh, you'd posed me to take advantage to say something I'll say. I don't know about graduation speeches in Europe. I haven't seen one. But another thing that got me thinking about these was that I have a friend who graduated from a Jesuit university in Guatemala, and I went to her graduation ceremony. And there was a female dean giving the speech, and it turned out all the graduates in that department that year were women. So she spoke about us, you know, nosotras, us. But then it was nothing but, you must serve your country. You must serve society. There was not a moment in there of flourish, follow your dreams. You know, it was not a moment. And so that put me on notice and made me wonder. And so at least for me, hearing this ethic of success repeated over and over in an American context was kind of like, say, if you'd gone to church a lot and heard them saying, you know, all that religious stuff, yay, God, that doesn't matter. You know, be happy, be rational. That's what matters. That's what matters. You know, it would be like hearing, for me, it was like hearing that. But I heard it a lot, so I realized that in America, the talk does have this unalloyed, flourishing-oriented and work-oriented character. Often. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, yeah, that's goes to a little bit my question. It sounded almost, when I was listening to your talk, that you were kind of grasping at straws a little bit to try to get that message, that really the underlying message is service and responsibility of others to others, and that the flourishing and such that was underlying that was coming through. And I was wondering, are there other venues that the students and the youth of them today that you see besides graduation ceremonies are getting a better message, or maybe there are graduation ceremonies where they're getting it straight out and not through this kind of somewhat filtered approach to the good life?
Well, actually, I didn't think these speeches were filtered at all. I hated I would give that impression. I mean, I think you couldn't listen to them and hear anything but the ethic of success. That's what they were about.
Super.
So other venues, you know, one of the things that's going on in the experience of young people who are in school, particularly K through 12 school now, is that, you know, in America we're going through this whole cultural anxiety about education. And this has expression in a lot of things, but in various places, attacks on the teacher monopolies, the expansion of charter schools in very many places, the expansion of testing of various kinds, the spread of the Common Core stuff that Larry Berlin's going to talk about later in the conference. And all those things are all about an anxiety about student capabilities and achievement, and a worry that not enough students are coming out of school well equipped. And the premise is that underlies that anxiety, I think, in most of the discussions I see, are about the individual students and their individual capabilities. So I think one of the things that's happening a lot in my kids' schools, for instance, is a lot of talk about, how do you achieve better, how do you work better, how do you know more, that kind of thing. Now, there are mixed premises. The public school monopolies sort of embody inefficiency. There's lots of vaporing at the administrative level. There's books to be written about it. But that's the kind of atmosphere they're in, where there's actually a lot of pressure about that these days.
As you know, I'm a recent graduate from high school, and from my experience, it has not been a question of go out, be successful for your own sake. It's been a question of for the sake of society, you have to go out and be successful. Do you have anything to respond to that?
You hear that a lot too. I mean, I think you definitely hear that a lot. In fact, that's what I would have expected to hear all the time. Because after all, if you go and take ethics classes, you'll hear that pursuing your personal success isn't even ethics. It isn't even ethics. It's, ethics is all about service and sacrifice and accommodating other people. That's what it is. And then a lot of of course, the majority of our K through 12 schools are public schools where their express purpose for existing is to provide some public purpose. They're understood as if they were providing a public good to the rest of society, that is the capable and willing people who will support everyone else. That's the idea. So I would expect in this culture where, the outright defenders of achievement and success in the intellectual culture of the country are very few, and in the culture of the educators, in the pedagogy education culture, where the teachers' colleges, it's Paulo Freire is what they're reading, Marxist Brazilian. They're not even beginning to be on those, being educated about that stuff. So I'm not at all surprised that you heard that a lot, and I think it's definitely there. But again, I'm just reporting from my evidence, and my evidence is, at least in some contexts, there is still a real ethic of success, and some students at least get to hear that. Thanks.
Well, I'm glad some students do.
Yeah.
Hi, Gary Lawson from Boston University School of Law. One observation that leads to a question. The observation suggests that at least the intellectual left may share your view that the American sense of life is very, very durable. Having been in the academy for almost 3 decades, I can assure you the war on that sense of life is quite vigorous. Some of the best evidence that perhaps they are realizing that it doesn't work is their now fanatical insistence on importing people from third world countries and cultures that do not share that sense of life. If they have figured out that American sense of life is so durable that it cannot be broken down, at least not in the short term, now their focus is on changing the composition of the country. And the question that leads me to is whether we can really speak of an American sense of life anymore. As you may remember, one of the topics I proposed that I might talk about at some future conference is whether the concept of America as a single nation still has meaning. Does it matter where you are in terms of what kind of sense of life you're going to see? My guess is that a random sampling of people in Cambridge is not going to give you the same result as a random sampling of people in Laramie. Can we really generalize about an American sense of life in the way that we could have 100 years ago? Oh, let me add one more thing to the observation. It's not just bringing in lots of people from third world countries and cultures, but combine that with the fanatical insistence that there be no effort or insistence on assimilation, that you keep the separateness. Do we still have an America to which you can attribute a sense of life as opposed to this area and this area and this culture and this culture?
So let me address your 2 questions there, or at least claim in a question, because I do want to clarify something about your claim that promoting open immigration to poor people from other countries is a way of undermining American culture. I happen to think that those people actually tend to be people who exemplify, by and large, the American sense of life. What I think of as the American sense of life, and they come here exactly in order to be able to live more independently, to be able to flourish from their work, to be able to achieve success. That's why they come. And there's so many people in the world, especially in third world countries, who would just love to have that opportunity to live in a freer country and to have the ability to be really rewarded for their work. So I guess I dispute that. Now, you also asked, is there one American culture, or perhaps is it broken up into separate things? And I guess I'll have to hear your talk to hear more of that argument. I think that 100 years ago or 120 years ago, there was, in a way, less of an America than there is now. And my parents were from Pennsylvania and Georgia. And they were from different planets. I mean, my father was a damn Yankee. Do you know what a damn Yankee was? The Yankees, they were up there in the north. Damn Yankees, they come down and they stay. They stay. The South Georgia small town near Plains that Jimmy Carter was from, that my mother was from, was just another world in my grandparents' generation than the Pennsylvania that my father grew up in. Culturally, attitudinally, it was just different. Today, if you live in Atlanta, you're going to sound just like somebody from Cleveland, Your accent won't be different. The telecommunication has connected us all in a shared vision of who we are much, much more than it was, I think, 100 years ago. So I think that's a problematic thesis, but I'd love to hear your argument because you've always got wise things to say, and I'd always be interested to hear that argument. So I think that's at the end of our time. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the conference.